The conference room was filled with chatter, papers rustling, and voices climbing over one another, until Claire Dawson's idea was ripped from her lips before she could even finish. Her colleague's voice thundered across the table, stealing her thought, presenting it as his own, while laughter and nods circled the room. Claire's throat tightened, her voice caught between protest and silence. She whispered inwardly, "Again, I am erased." The sound of applause to his theft rang louder than her pulse, stabbing at every quiet wound she carried from childhood, when every dream was dismissed and every word silenced. She wanted to scream, but silence smothered her like a noose. Her colleague leaned back with smug ease, the manager praising him, while Claire's hands trembled beneath the desk. In that moment, shame and fury collided in her chest, and a single truth formed in her mind: if I stay silent forever, I will die unseen. Claire Dawson walked down the corridor after the meeting, her footsteps echoing against polished floors. She muttered, "Even my words don't belong to me." The laughter of colleagues spilled from behind the door as if mocking her. She pressed her hand to her chest, whispering, "I am fading." At home that evening, Claire Dawson sat by the window as the city lights flickered alive. She whispered, "I was born in silence, raised in shadows, and now I live unseen." Memories of her mother's dismissive tone returned, reminding her of every time she was told, "You're too quiet to matter." Claire muttered, "But I do matter, even if no one sees it yet." The next day at work, Claire Dawson overheard colleagues joking about the stolen idea, their voices sharp daggers. She bit back tears, whispering, "Even my pain is their entertainment." She turned toward the break room mirror, staring at her reflection, and said, "This silence will kill me before failure ever could." That night, Claire Dawson sat in bed with the lights off, the glow of her phone lighting her face. She whispered into the stillness, "If I vanish, will anyone notice?" The silence answered with crushing weight. She closed her eyes, breathing shallow, and whispered, "I can't stay invisible forever. Something must break, either me or the silence." The office buzzed with morning noise as Claire Dawson sat at her desk, hands hovering above the keyboard, but unable to type. She whispered to herself, "They'll just steal this too." Her colleague and confidante, Michael Reed, passed by and stopped, his voice carrying bluntness. Michael said, "You look like you're writing ghosts instead of words." Claire frowned and said, "Because ghosts have more of a voice than I do here." Michael leaned against her desk and said, "You keep letting them erase you. No one can respect what they can't hear." Claire shook her head and said, "When I speak, I stumble. When I stay silent, I disappear." Michael sighed and said, "Then choose stumbling, Claire. At least that leaves footprints." Her gaze lingered on the screen, her reflection in the black monitor whispering her doubt back at her. At lunch, Claire Dawson sat across from Michael Reed in the break room, her sandwich untouched. Claire said, "I grew up in a house where silence was survival. If you spoke, you were mocked." Michael chewed slowly, then said, "So you carried their rules here, even when no one's playing that game." Claire's voice trembled as she said, "The rules don't leave you, even when you leave the house." Michael leaned forward and said, "Then write new rules. No one's stopping you but yourself." Claire stared at him and said, "It's not that easy." Michael smirked faintly and said, "No, it's not. But easy is what kept you invisible." That evening, Claire Dawson walked home beneath streetlights, her thoughts echoing louder than traffic. She whispered, "I carry their laughter like chains." She recalled her mother's sharp tone, "Stop dreaming so loud," and her father's dismissive shrug. Claire's fists tightened at her sides as she said, "They silenced me before I even found my voice." A car passed, its headlights washing her in pale glow, and she whispered, "But I won't let their ghosts decide my future." Her steps grew firmer, yet her heart trembled. The next morning, Claire Dawson sat at her desk during a meeting, her idea written clearly in her notes. She opened her mouth, but another colleague began speaking over her. Claire's chest tightened. She whispered to herself, "Not again." Michael Reed glanced at her across the table and mouthed, "Say it." Claire's voice shook as she interrupted, "Actually, that was my suggestion." The room fell silent, eyes turning toward her. Heat crawled up her neck, but she steadied herself, repeating with clarity, "That was my idea, and I believe it deserves consideration." Her words hung heavy in the air, trembling but unbroken. That night at home, Claire Dawson sat on the edge of her bed, phone buzzing with unread messages. She whispered, "I spoke, and they looked at me like I was fire." Her chest ached, fear mingling with pride. She stared into the mirror across the room and said, "I wasn't invisible today." Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "But why does visibility feel like battle?" Her reflection stared back, weary but alive. She muttered, "I've lived in silence for so long. Maybe the fight is the only way to live at all." The morning sun painted the office in pale gold, but Claire Dawson's chest was heavy with dread. She opened her inbox to find a chain of emails praising her colleague for his brilliant idea, the very one she had finally claimed as her own. Claire muttered, "Even when I speak, they pretend I never did." Michael Reed approached her desk, leaning against it with his usual bluntness. Michael said, "You look like someone just buried your voice again." Claire clenched her fists and said, "They praised him, Michael. They still erased me." Michael shrugged and said, "So? You said it out loud this time. They can't erase the fact you stood up." Claire's voice cracked as she said, "If no one remembers, it's like I never existed." Michael's eyes hardened as he said, "Existence isn't about their memory, Claire. It's about your fight to be seen, even if you bleed for it." At lunch, Claire Dawson sat at the edge of the cafeteria, her tray untouched. Michael Reed joined her, biting into his sandwich with casual defiance. Claire whispered, "What if my voice is just too small to matter?" Michael smirked dryly and said, "Your voice isn't small, Claire. Your fear is loud." Claire's eyes flickered with pain as she said, "Fear is all I've ever known. It's the first language I learned." Michael leaned closer and said, "Then unlearn it. Learn silence when it's strength and noise when it's power. Don't let fear keep writing your script." Claire stared at her tray and said, "And if I fail?" Michael's voice cut sharp. "Failing is louder than disappearing. Pick one." That evening, Claire Dawson walked the empty streets, her breath curling in the cool air. She muttered, "I live in a body filled with echoes." She recalled her father's voice, "Stop embarrassing yourself with dreams," and her mother's quiet laugh at her ambitions. Claire pressed her palms to her ears and whispered, "Get out of my head." She stopped at a storefront mirror, her reflection fragmented by neon lights. She said, "I am more than their ridicule." A passing stranger glanced at her with faint curiosity, and she whispered, "They can't hear me, but I hear myself." The next morning, Claire Dawson stood in the meeting room again, her notes clutched tight. A colleague interrupted as always, claiming credit for ideas that weren't his. Claire's voice trembled but rose above his. "No, that was mine. I said it last week, and I'm saying it again." The room stilled. Her colleague scoffed, You barely speak." Claire's gaze hardened as she said, "Maybe I didn't speak then, but I am speaking now, and I won't stop." Michael Reed smirked from across the table, his arms crossed as if daring anyone to argue. Claire's chest burned with terror and pride as silence pressed down on the room. That night, Claire Dawson sat by her window with the city glowing below. She whispered, "I said it." My voice filled the room, even if they hated it. She touched her throat gently, as though confirming it still belonged to her. She whispered, "This silence inside me is cracking, and my voice is breaking through." Tears filled her eyes, not of weakness but of release. She muttered, "I thought I needed their permission, but all I ever needed was my own." The city's hum seemed to answer her, carrying her words into the night like a vow. The office felt heavier than usual as Claire Dawson entered, her colleagues' laughter rising from the corner of the room. She heard them mocking softly, mimicking her voice from yesterday's meeting. Claire paused, her heart pounding, but instead of retreating she walked past them with deliberate steps. One colleague whispered, "She thinks she's important now." Claire stopped, turned, and said, "I don't think, I know my work matters, whether you laugh or not." The words fell like stone on glass, leaving a crack in their mockery. Michael Reed, leaning against the far wall, smirked and said, "Finally, she hits back." Claire's chest burned, fear coiling with defiance, but her lips refused to tremble this time. She whispered inwardly, "I will not be erased again." Later in the day, Michael Reed cornered Claire Dawson in the break room, his tone blunt but steady. Michael said, "Not bad, Claire. You've got teeth after all." Claire's eyes softened with unease as she said, "I felt like I was shaking inside." Michael shrugged and said, "So what? Courage isn't about not shaking. It's about speaking while your hands won't stop trembling." Claire pressed her palms to the counter and whispered, "It still felt like they were laughing louder than my words." Michael leaned closer and said, "Then next time, make them choke on the laughter. You don't fight shadows with whispers, you fight them by refusing to vanish." Claire met his eyes and said, "And if I fail again?" Michael smirked and said, "Then fail loudly. At least they'll remember the sound." That night, Claire Dawson sat at her desk at home with papers scattered, writing furiously in her notebook. She whispered, "All the times they silenced me, all the names they gave me. Too quiet, too weak, invisible." Her pen scratched faster as she wrote each word. She said aloud, "These words aren't my identity. They're shackles I am breaking." She ripped a page free, tearing it in half, her breath shaking as the pieces fell. "This silence was never mine," she muttered. "It was theirs, forced on me. And I'm done carrying it." She pressed her palms against her chest, closing her eyes, whispering, "My silence will be my weapon, not my prison." The room felt like a battlefield, her notebook the first banner raised. The next morning, Claire Dawson sat in the courtyard outside the office, trying to steady her thoughts. Michael Reed joined her with his coffee, eyeing her notebook. Michael said, "Still writing your war plans?" Claire looked up, lips tight, and said, "I'm writing every word they threw at me, so I can see what I'm fighting against." Michael took a sip and said, "Good. A soldier needs to know her enemy. But remember, half those words live only in your head now." Claire's voice wavered as she said, "They still feel like chains." Michael's gaze hardened as he said, "Chains only stay chains if you keep bowing to them. Stand up, and they turn into nothing more than noise." Claire whispered, "Then maybe it's time to stand taller than their laughter." That evening, Claire Dawson returned home exhausted, dropping her bag by the door. She looked into the mirror on the wall, the reflection of her tired face staring back. She whispered, "I am not the same woman who stayed quiet yesterday." Her hands touched the glass, as though reaching for someone on the other side. She said, "I am still afraid, but fear no longer rules me. I will speak, I will fight, and if I fall, I will rise again." Tears ran down her cheeks as she added, "For the first time, I believe I can be heard." The silence of her apartment felt different this time, less like a cage, more like a seed ready to break open. The office meeting began with the usual chatter, papers shuffling as the manager praised efficiency over creativity. Claire Dawson sat upright, her notes ready, her heart pounding like a drum she could not silence. A colleague across the table smirked and said, "Maybe Claire has something, though it'll probably take her an hour to spit it out." Laughter trickled through the room. Claire's throat burned, but she forced herself to speak, her voice trembling at first. "Yes, I do have something, and it won't take an hour. What I have is clarity, something you could all use." The laughter cut short. Her colleague shifted uncomfortably, muttering, "Relax, it was just a joke." Claire's eyes sharpened as she said, "Jokes stop being funny when they're only made to keep someone small." Silence fell heavy. Michael Reed leaned back with his arms folded, his smirk hidden behind his cup of coffee, as if he had been waiting for this exact fire to ignite. After the meeting, Claire Dawson hurried into the corridor, her chest heaving as adrenaline still surged. Michael Reed caught up, voice low but cutting. Michael said, "You finally spat fire, and they actually shut up. That's something." Claire pressed her back against the wall and whispered, "My whole body was shaking. I thought I'd collapse." Michael chuckled and said, "Shaking means nothing, Claire. What matters is the words left your mouth and burned the air." Claire closed her eyes and said, "It felt dangerous, like I crossed some line I can't step back from." Michael leaned close and said, "Good. Lines aren't for stepping back. They're for crossing until you can't even see the place you started." Claire opened her eyes slowly and said, "Then maybe I should burn every line they've drawn around me." Michael smirked and said, "Now you're finally talking like someone alive." That evening Claire Dawson sat in the cafe across from Michael Reed, her coffee untouched. Claire whispered, "Do you ever wonder if we're doomed to repeat the same silence forever?" Michael raised an eyebrow and said, "You think I'm quiet?" "No, Claire, I chose distance." "That's different. You didn't choose yours. It was forced on you." Claire stared into her cup and said, "Then maybe I don't know who I am without the silence." Michael leaned forward and said, "Then figure it out. Test yourself. The world's already told you 1,000 times who you aren't. Stop waiting for them to tell you who you are." Claire's lips trembled as she said, "And what if I find nothing there?" Michael's eyes hardened as he said, "Then build something there. From nothing you can make everything. But you've got to start." At home later, Claire Dawson stood before her notebook, scribbling furiously. She whispered, "I am not invisible. I am not weak. I am not their joke." She wrote each sentence like a strike against the past. Then she wrote slower, "I am seen. I am strong. I am my own." She stared at the words until tears blurred the ink. "But am I ready to prove it?" she muttered. Her reflection in the window seemed to stare back, challenging her. She said, "If I don't, I'll rot here. If I do, maybe I'll break. But I'd rather break as myself than live forever as their shadow." The city lights blinked back at her, like silent witnesses waiting for her answer. The next morning, Claire Dawson entered the office with a stillness that carried weight. Her colleagues eyed her cautiously, sensing a shift. One muttered, "She's different today." Claire sat down, folded her hands and said calmly, "Yes, I am, and I won't apologize for it." The room went quiet, a silence unfamiliar but powerful. Michael Reed caught her gaze from across the room, nodding subtly, as if saying, "You've finally stepped out of your own grave." Claire whispered inwardly, "For the first time, silence isn't my prison. It's my power. And I will decide when to break it." The office gathered for a quarterly presentation, tension humming in the air, as Claire Dawson prepared her slides. Her manager said, "We'll begin with Robert's proposal," motioning toward the same colleague who had stolen her ideas before. Robert spoke loudly, rehearsed confidence dripping from every word. Claire's hands trembled as she gripped the table. Michael Reed leaned over and whispered, "If you don't claim your space now, he'll bury you in it." Claire inhaled sharply, then rose to her feet. Her voice cracked but held steady. "Actually, before we move forward, I'd like to present what I've been working on. It addresses the same issues but from a different angle." Robert's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. The manager frowned, then gestured for her to continue. Claire's pulse raced, but her words began to flow, every sentence anchoring her more firmly to the ground she once feared to stand on. After the meeting, Robert confronted Claire Dawson in the hallway, his voice dripping with disdain. Robert said, "So you've decided to play brave now, stealing the spotlight?" Claire's jaw tightened as she said, "Brave isn't stealing, it's reclaiming what you took." Robert's smirk sharpened. "People only remember the loudest voice. You'll never be that." Claire stepped closer, eyes steady, and said, "Maybe I don't need to be loud. Maybe I just need to be unshakable." Robert scoffed and muttered, "We'll see how long that lasts." Michael Reed appeared behind Claire, his voice calm but firm. "Longer than your arrogance, Robert." Robert sneered but walked away, leaving Claire trembling with both fear and triumph. She whispered, "I didn't crumble. Not this time." That night, Claire Dawson sat in her apartment, staring at her notebook filled with affirmations. She whispered, "I spoke, I fought, and I was heard." Her voice cracked, tears pooling. "So why does it still feel like a war I'm losing inside?" She pressed her hand to her chest, the weight of years of silence pressing harder than the day's victory. Michael Reed's words replayed in her mind, "Fail loudly." She muttered, Maybe the battle is not against them. Maybe it's against me. She leaned back in her chair and whispered into the quiet. I've been carrying their voices so long I forgot my own. The silence around her no longer felt empty, it felt waiting. The next morning in the break room, Michael Reed found Claire Dawson staring at her reflection in the microwave door. Michael said, "You look like you wrestled your own shadow all night." Claire forced a half smile and said, "It feels like my shadow is heavier than the whole office combined." Michael crossed his arms and said, "Good, that means you're finally fighting the right enemy." Claire frowned, "You mean myself?" Michael nodded, "Exactly. Beat yourself, Claire, and no one out there stands a chance." Claire leaned back against the counter and whispered, "And if I lose to myself?" Michael smirked and said, "Then you get up and fight again. The only way you lose is if you stop showing up." Claire stared at him, voice barely audible. "Then I'll keep showing up even if it kills me." Later that week, Claire Dawson walked into the office earlier than anyone else. She placed her notebook on the center of the meeting table and whispered, "This silence is mine now, not theirs." She sat in the chair at the head of the table, inhaling deeply, the empty room amplifying her presence. Michael Reed entered moments later, raising an eyebrow. Michael said, "Stealing the throne already?" Claire's lips curved faintly as she said, "Not stealing, claiming." Michael chuckled and said, "Careful, they'll call you arrogant next." Claire's eyes hardened as she said, "Let them. Better arrogant than invisible." Michael nodded, a rare softness in his voice. "Finally, Claire, you sound like someone who knows she belongs here." The quarterly review was packed, with senior executives present, their expressions sharpened by expectation. Claire Dawson sat with her notes steady before her, though her heart beat like a war drum. The manager said, "Robert will begin," but Claire rose before Robert could stand. Her voice rang clear, "I'd like to present first." The room stilled, surprise flashing across faces. Robert muttered under his breath, "Trying to steal my thunder again." Claire looked at him with calm fire and said, "I don't need your thunder. I have my own." Executives leaned forward, curious. Claire's hands didn't shake this time as she laid out her work. Every word came with precision, every pause deliberate. The silence after her final sentence felt sacred, unbroken, until an executive finally said, "This is thoughtful, original, and it deserves recognition." Robert fidgeted, but the air already belonged to her. Claire whispered inwardly, "This is my voice, and it stands." As the meeting broke, Robert stormed out, brushing past Claire Dawson with a scowl. He hissed, "You'll regret undermining me." Claire's voice cut sharp but calm. "I didn't undermine you, Robert. I revealed myself." Robert spat, "You think they'll respect you? They'll chew you up and spit you out." Claire met his glare, her voice unyielding. "Let them try. I've been chewed on all my life. I'm still here." Michael Reed, standing nearby, added dryly, "You might want to find a new trick, Robert. The old ones don't scare anyone anymore." Robert's eyes darted away, his fury collapsing into silence as he stormed off. Claire exhaled, her pulse still racing, whispering to herself, "I didn't back down. Not once." Later that day, Claire Dawson sat with Michael Reed in the courtyard, the quiet breeze brushing through autumn leaves. Claire said, "I feel like I walked into battle today, and somehow walked out alive." Michael sipped his coffee and said, "Not somehow, you walked out alive because you finally fought." Claire's voice faltered, "But why do I still feel hollow, like there's a part of me missing?" Michael's eyes softened, rare honesty breaking through his usual sharpness. "Because you fought one battle, Claire, not the whole war. You've spent a lifetime erasing yourself. One speech won't fill that void." Claire nodded slowly, whispering, "Then I'll keep filling it, piece by piece." Michael tilted his head and said, "That's the only way. Keep showing up until even you believe the sound of your voice belongs." That evening, Claire Dawson sat in her apartment, with her notebook open, pages filled with affirmations, crossed out doubts, and scribbled hopes. She whispered, "I thought silence was my enemy, but maybe it was only waiting for me to learn how to wield it." She wrote in careful script, "Silence is not absence, it is space to grow." Her reflection in the dark window met her gaze. She whispered, "I was afraid of being unseen, but I see myself now." Her tears were steady but quiet, not of despair but of release. She closed her notebook and said aloud, "If they never see me, if they never hear me, it won't matter anymore. I hear myself." The next morning, Claire Dawson walked to the office before dawn, the streets empty, the sky painted in pale gray. She stood at the entrance, whispering, "I was invisible once. I am not invisible anymore." Her reflection in the glass doors showed a woman still carrying fear, but fear no longer owned her. She pushed the doors open, her steps steady, her silence no longer heavy but chosen. She whispered, "This silence is my rebirth. This voice is mine." And as the first light of morning spilled across the lobby, Claire Dawson smiled, not with triumph, but with peace.